New insights, new styles, and new topics every day.
We are News Generation.
Making news just for you. It's May 25th here in Seoul. I'm Shin, and this is News Generation, where we make the news at Arirang's very own open studio. Every morning, we'll discuss the top issues and latest current affairs affecting people in their 20s and 30s. Joining me in the studio is Nail Song.
Good morning, everyone.
Good morning, and Park Ki-hoon.
Thank you for having me.
Now, both are here to speak on behalf of people in their 20s and 30s. Let's start with our news feed, which covers different hashtags and news items that have been trending on social media over the past 24 hours. Now, the 2023 Cannes Film Festival, which kicked off last week, has welcomed many Korean celebrities. This includes K-pop stars like Blackpink's Jennie. Jennie had come to attend the premiere of the HBO drama series The Idol. Also at the 76th International Film Festival, K-pop girl group aespa and actors Hong Joong-ki made an appearance. A total of 7 Korean films have been selected to be screened, but none made it to the competition lineup. Moving on to the next story, sharing your Netflix account outside of your household is no longer allowed in the United States. The streaming service giant on Tuesday began to warn its users about their latest sharing policy. In an email, Netflix told subscribers that they would have to pay an extra fee of $7.99 per month if they want another user outside of their household using their services. Now, this comes as Netflix found that 43% of its global user base were accessing Netflix through shared accounts. Last but not least, China has blocked off South Korea's largest online portal, Naver, from this Monday. Koreans living in China said they were unable to access the portal's email and search functions. Now, this came just after the G7 summit when key democracies like the US also engaged with its allies like South Korea. At the summit, Washington called on China to step up its game against Russia's war in Ukraine. Now, let's take a closer look at the third news item. The Korean Foreign Ministry is still looking into this matter, but experts believe this is another form of Beijing censoring countries as retaliation amid geopolitical tensions. Now, since 2016, when Seoul and Washington tried to deploy the THAAD, which is also known as the Terminal High Altitude Area Defense System, China has been restricting games or entertainment content made by Korean companies. Now, China's strict regulations against anything made from Korea only recently seem to be lifted, but following Naver's block-off in China, we also heard that K-pop band CNBLUE's Chung Yonghwa was canceled from appearing on a Chinese entertainment program. Now, here in the studio, how would you read into this situation, Ki-hoon?
This is not the first time China has retaliated in this manner. Geopolitical tensions affect the country's economy immensely, like what we're seeing in the war in the Ukraine. And actions like these only causes more disruption among countries, and it can even affect livelihoods of people. So I think China should really step down a little and just ease their censorship, strict censorship, because it's affecting Korea too much. And I'm sure back in China, there are many, many fans who still want to see K-pop idols and K-dramas, all about K-content. So I think these political tensions can just, move to the side a bit and just leave the entertainment and content industry just the way it is.
Right. Not only speaking on a diplomatic matter, I think a lot of fans, as you mentioned, are very disappointed about what's happening and the line between politics and culture being blurred. But what are your thoughts on this now?
Taking all emotions out of this, I don't think it's an effective solution for any diplomatic tension. Censoring culture or information only takes people backwards, and in this day and age, people will always find a way to crack or watch it illegally. And as we know, North Korea is one of the most censored countries in the world, and yet people still manage to watch K-dramas at the risk of their own safety.
And News Gen as well.
Yeah, right. Are you watching? Hi. Yeah, but this really doesn't change much for the tension that's there, but it's more of, pride battles. So like you said, let's move past this.
Don't make it be a fight between egos.
Right.
All right, let's move on to our discussion topic of the day. We're seeing more people in their 20s and 30s dying alone. Take a look at the screen to find out more. Every year in Korea, we see around 3,000 people die alone. The health ministry found that as of 2021, at least 200 of those who died alone were in their 20s and 30s. Though it's a relatively small figure, it's alarming that we're seeing more of these deaths coming from the new generation. High living costs, fewer opportunities to settle down with a job, and a feeling of isolation is pushing many young people to the brink. Today, News Gen aims to look at 3 questions. 1. Different countries have different terms defining loners. For instance, in Japan, there's the concept of hikikomori. Here in Korea, how do we define loners? 2. While there are some that end up dying alone from natural causes, there are also some who feel so lonely that they take their own lives. What pushes them to do so? 3. How are governments around the world trying to tackle this issue? Are their policies effective? So feeling isolated is a scary thing. What's even more frightening is feeling you have no choice but to take your own life, and that nobody seems to be there to weep for your death. Alarmingly, though, a growing number of those in their 20s and 30s are feeling that way and have died alone, especially since COVID-19. So now, why don't you walk us through actual figures to show how many loners and the COVID-19 has affected them, and why don't you define what we consider to be loners in Korea?
Sure. I've actually prepared a visual aid, so why don't we take a look at the screen? Actually, the definition of socially withdrawn, according to research, is from ages 19 to 39. As you can see on the right side of the graph, there's no economic activity that they're doing, and they spend most of their time at home. And obviously, this can happen for a short amount of time for anyone, really. But this survey is classifying it as socially withdrawn when the state has been maintained for over 6 months. And if you look at the left side of the graph, you can tell that the number of these people greatly increased over the course of 2 years between 2019 and 2021. This was actually a huge jump of 204,000 who fit the definition we just mentioned. And a lot of it is actually due to COVID and people losing their jobs, having to become isolated and staying that way for a long time after.
Right now, I understand why COVID-19 played a big part in it. We've seen a lot of people get laid off during COVID-19. And as you mentioned, you have to be alone at your house, no economic activity for 6 whole months. And now I would like to ask, what are some ways the Korean government is trying to help these young people from taking extreme measures, more specifically taking their own lives? Now?
Right. So the Korean government has started moving towards supporting these reclusive youths by doing surveys on such people, studying various cases, as well as, seeing how the pandemic has affected people. And there are now services such as personal counseling or active programs in art, in sports, but also specifically with job searching. They help people to explore different options in careers, increase their potential of getting employment by prepping them for interviews. And Seoul City is actually at a head start with this, but many other cities like Busan and Gwangju are following right behind. And this is not just, national, but it's a global issue.
It is a global issue, and that's why people are debating whether should be only solved on the individual front, whether it should be like our friend or family member we're taking of, or whether the government should be playing an integral role. And I would like to ask your thoughts on this, Kyun. How important of a role do you think the government should be playing in helping these young people out?
Yeah, definitely. The government plays a huge role trying to tackle this kind of issue. But I just want to say at the same time, as individuals who are considered legally adults, they should be a little more aware of their own emotions and the underlying conditions before putting any kind of blame or responsibility on other factors. But going back to the role of the government, they reported in March that out of 15,000 households surveyed on living conditions, 2.4% of youths responded to mostly staying at home, the main reason being unemployment. And what's more concerning is that youths who don't put in any kind of effort to improve this kind of condition are prone to continue to live with this condition throughout their lives. And obviously, as they age, and they live by themselves, like we saw from the news feed, they end up just kind of, dying by themselves without anyone knowing. So the Seoul Metropolitan Government announced they will create regional hub spaces where isolated and reclusive youth can engage in activities until 2025. So they will also establish a one-stop support and management process to help identify and reintegrate isolated and reclusive youth into society. And this will allow, obviously, family members and acquaintances to have continuous counseling, application and requests. So hopefully this could be a concrete stepping stone for these kind of secluded youth to come back into society.
And I completely agree. The government does seem to have a very important role, especially in the case of boosting employment rates, giving them more opportunities to come outside. But as we mentioned, if they're home alone for 6 months without any employment activity, and human beings are so easily adjusting to their environment, would they take that? I think would they take that opportunity to go out themselves? I think that's definitely a matter we have to shed more light to. And it's not only an issue confined to Korea. I know, as you mentioned, Nell, that this is a global problem, a global societal issue. Then how are other countries dealing with it?
Yeah, actually in Japan, this phenomenon is called hikikomori, and this started in the 80s and 90s as youth, just like in Korea, had a difficult time finding jobs. And this developed as, technology advanced. There are different types of games and platforms to have entertainment. And so people are spending more and more time alone. And Japan's Ministry of Health, Labor, and Welfare came up with a regional support group, like the ones that we just mentioned, to help this hikikomori phenomenon. And they have consultations and home visitations, which I thought was great because, it's really thoughtful as we are approaching them first, not forcing them out of their comfort zone. And they're raising awareness on issues as well as, doing suicide prevention campaigns. Because a lot of these hikikomori or, reclusive youths are dealing with mental health illnesses at the same time. And in the US, they call these people NEET. It's, not in education or employment. And it's been more than a year since all of that. And the focus on that is a little more towards education and classes to return them to the job market. Although I'm sure everybody is struggling in a mental way somehow.
Right, so they're focusing on the mental front. Now, Ki-hoon, would you like to add a few other countries that are dealing with this problem as well?
Yes, going to Europe. In Germany, the education system as early as the middle school help students choose their career path based on their personal interest and talents for more freedom and preference with their career. And in Finland, there are employment and welfare services for youth like seminars, workshops, recruitment programs, and even subsidy support for those who are unemployed and trying to seek new jobs for 3 months.
I see. All right. And a central part to this issue seems to be mental health. That's why we're going to be hearing from a mental health expert to diagnose why this is happening. We're going to hear from a mental health expert who also has experience counseling isolated young people seeking help. It's Hwang Sun-mi, professor at Torch Trinity Graduate University. Welcome, Professor Hwang.
Thank you for having me.
All right, so as mentioned before, we think that mental health is a very critical issue that a lot of loners go through. Now, what's the psychological process or emotions people who are isolated go through, and how does the degree of depression hit them differently compared to others with a lot of people around them?
In the case of chronic loners, we have to understand that at the beginning stage, they actively choose isolation as a strategy to avoid interpersonal conflict. As we all know, there are many emotional difficulties when we try to solve the relational problems. Frustration, anger, sadness, feeling betrayed, you just name it. These emotional burdens are involved in relationship. Loners tend to choose to cut off to protect themselves from these negative emotions. It may give relief in a short-term period, but long-term isolation increases the sense of solitude, and most of all, it increases fear to get back into the world again. This condition can make them vulnerable to have mental symptoms, like you said, for example, depression, victimization, or sometimes the phobias. But we must not forget that at the unconscious level, they also want to feel connected with the people and feel welcomed by people.
And that's why we're seeing a lot of them, because it's a cry for help and they need people. And that's why they're making the decision when they can't find help to take their own lives. It seems like the more lonely or isolated you are, the more you actually become vulnerable. So how important is our environment on our mental health?
For sure, the social environment is truly an important factor, not only for mental health, but for the matter of maladjustment prevention. We human beings are born in relationships, whether we choose or not. And also, we are going through negative thoughts and emotions like loneliness and feeling isolated. These are difficult to deal with, and not easily disappeared unless they are contained in interpersonal relationships. In psychology, this kind of relationship we call that holding environment, which means safe and supportive psychological space that provide a sense of warmth. The holding environment can be a great resource toward recovery, especially when a person is going through hardship. Social environment is a fundamental ingredient for a person to live a healthy life, I think.
Yeah.
I cannot agree with you more, Professor. What do you think about the different policies and efforts made by the Korean government? Do you think they are effective?
In recent years, Korean government seemed to recognize the challenges faced by young adult generation. Since 2021, Seoul city government has been provided a mental care program and individual counseling sessions to young adults. I also was a member of this program last year, and I felt that the government mind care program was actually done effectively. All participants took psychological assessment, and according to the result, they received the proper type of care. And if further help was necessary, I could refer them to local welfare institutions. However, I think there are still limitations in these policies. First, as you mentioned already, a lot of these policies are found only in Seoul or Gyeonggi area. And most of all, voluntary engagement system is difficult to include the loners that we are talking about right now and who are in serious need of assistance.
Exactly. That's exactly the question I wanted to ask you right next, because if you're a loner and you feel isolated, you might feel helpless. You might not voluntarily go out of your house to seek help. But the policies that are happening not only in Korea but in other parts of the world require a lot of active and voluntary action. So what do you think the government or people should do to better help people who are isolated?
Personally, I believe that prevention is first and foremost. If people around the loners can notice the symptoms before they isolate themselves, and if people around the loners know how and where to assist them, it will be the first aid. And government's role is to increase public awareness through long-term educational campaign. It should be long-term. And family support services are also necessary because in many situations, family is the only people who can meet the loners in person.
Right.
So family needs a manualized guideline and information about social network services. To handle this kind of issue, what we consider is always point of how to make a connection with them. A good alternative, I think, is to expand the semi-online counseling services so that loners can maintain a certain level of communication, and also they can be aware that there are people waiting for them and open chances for them to engage outside the world.
Especially, as you mentioned, because they're subconsciously always looking for a hand of help.
Yes.
Right. All right. All right. Thank you so much, Professor. It was such a pleasure to have you on our show today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right. And before we continue our talks, we're also going to hear from our global viewers and what they had to say on today's discussion topic. Take a look at the screen to find out. So Chris Garcia said, I believe the young generation, Gen Z, communicates differently via social media. They're used to this platform and communicating this way, so when someone tries to talk to them in person or call them, it could be a bit strange for them. Ashika said, I personally believe young Gen Z are more individualistic, but we don't really back out from group activity. And social media helps us to connect to people all over the world, so I don't think we are as antisocial. Leon Teo said the younger generation is more self-centered and individualistic. They would rather spend time more on themselves to have their own personal space, and having the freedom to express themselves is what's important. And I think the general gist of what our viewers are trying to say, that, you know, though it's a very similar concept to loners, but I think more and more of the Gen Z value and really prioritize spending time alone.
Right.
But that's a little different from today's discussion topic. We're talking
but I
about,
think it's connecting actually with the tendencies of Gen Z wanting to spend more time alone.
Right.
But I think what the professor and doctor was saying, that we need to actually find a good balance before we actually go into this intense seclusion. So we need to prevent it.
Exactly.
So it's good to know that they are like that.
It's good to know what type of traits we have, but let's prevent it from going on to a mental health issue or, people taking extreme measures. And before we end off, let me share a recent survey. It says that 4 out of 10 loners aren't happy with their lives, which is not a surprise. And what are your thoughts on that here in the studio?
I think happiness is a choice, not an emotion. So if you choose to be happy and live a happy life, then that's the first step towards living a very satisfied life. So it all comes down to how you perceive yourself. And just looking around you, yeah, you might feel a little, left out, lonely perhaps, but just starting from the basics, why you exist, the presence you have in this world. You will start being loved once you reach out, which is not easy, but like what the professor said, it all started from having too much pressure from people. So it started from people, right? But at the same time, I think we can be cured and healed by people in return. So guys, it's okay to stay alone, but at the same time, we need the support from the people. So it's okay to open out at the same time.
Right, especially as the professor mentioned, a lot of them subconsciously want that help. For sure. What about you, Nell? What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I think just going back to the interview we had, just talking about that sense of warmth that everybody needs, even though you're looking for it on social media, like we mentioned with our viewers as well. I think everybody needs that, and like the professor was saying, they're looking for it and they're protecting themselves when they can't get it. So I think I understand why people chose to do it, but like I said, we really need to go back to the whole prevention thing, that there needs to be a safe balance when they do this. Yeah.
And at the end of the day, if you want that type of help, I think the professor mentioned a very good point, which was incorporating the digital media. Digitally, we could have more counseling options out there for people who might not want to physically go out of their homes. They could do it online. And last but not least, I would like to ask you guys, how would you like to see the government or even people like us better address this issue?
With me, I've gone through some dark phases in my life, and I did overcome it. But for me, it was seeking help through family members and friends that I trusted to kind of, alleviate the burden that I put on myself when I didn't really have to. But if that's an issue, if that's not easy for you, there's always the government who's willing to support and give maximum help, because they're willing to reach out first. So all I want to say is that, don't worry too much, just be happy.
Right, and what about you, Nell?
It was great to hear that the government's help is actually effective, but I did hear civilians doing things like the NEAT company, where people are gathering people who are in seclusion to come out and work towards something. Obviously, it's not a real company, but I think having that societal movement to bring people out and do something together, that's a great start.
Right, and while I was researching for a discussion topic today, I realized it made me think, I should contact people more often. I should look out for my friends and family
I'm always
members.
waiting.
Reach
I will
out.
contact you more often.
Yes.
More tender love and care.
But I think that's what we can do on our level. We could just see if everyone around us is doing okay, because it's those small gestures that pile up and really could be a big hand of help. And why don't we now wrap up on that note? We'll be here every day from 9:30 to 10 a.m. Korea time, bringing you more topics young people are talking about. Special thanks to Niall Song.
No problem.
And Park Ki-hoon.
It's always a pleasure.
All right. Thank you everyone for watching. We'll see you tomorrow. We are
News Generation.